Welcome to the Cardinal News of Virginia, a podcast from Cardinal News. We are a nonprofit news outlet. We cover Southwest and Southside Virginia at cardinalnews.org. I'm Dutchie Jessee. I want to say a thank you to our sponsor, and that is Muneris, serving communities with expert group benefits and Medicare solutions. Well, today we are going to start, we're going to talk about a series that's recently been publishing in Cardinal News, and that is called Paper of Record. It's authored by Grace Mamon, who covers Danville for us. Hi, Grace.
Hi, Dutchie.
Welcome, and let's just get to it. The Paper of Record, that's the title of the series. What does that mean? What's it referring to?
Yeah, so the phrase paper of record refers to a reputable newspaper that is kind of considered the go-to for a certain community. It is relied on to capture what's going on day to day. And so we're thinking about it kind of in a historical term. The paper of record of the day is how people today, modern folks learn about a certain time period. And so that gets more complicated, of course, when journalistic norms have evolved over time, and maybe the paper of record 60 years ago wasn't as accurate or as transparent as papers today should be, by modern standards. So it's really kind of interesting then and now.
Mm-hmm. And what we're referring to is you specifically are talking about this period in its national history, civil rights movement during the 1960s. But you have focused on Danville and what happened at the time in Danville. I should tell people you earlier did some work on a project that we called Bloody Monday, which was focused on this movement in Danville. And that was, bring us up to speed really quick on that. What did that look at? It looked at a particular day, obviously, but tell us just a little about that.
Right. So my previous coverage on Danville's civil rights movement, which was during the summer of 1963, it focused on June 10th, 1963, which was the first violent clash of that summer where demonstrators were met with police brutality by Danville's police force. It's a really fascinating movement in that it was kind of on the same level of intensity of the Birmingham, Alabama civil rights movement, but it didn't get nearly the same amount of coverage, of acknowledgement, even though, it was right there in terms of intensity. So I covered that day and the rest of the summer and have since then, that was 2 years ago now, I think. Yeah, it was around the 60th anniversary of 1963. And so now we're 62 years later. I've been looking for ways to continue to do follow-ups and continue to do new angles on this story that was so underreported for so long.
Yeah, which is a comment we received plenty of, was that people who've lived in the region or near it. I have a friend in Eden, North Carolina, who said never had he heard of Bloody Monday. So that brought a lot of attention to a story. So expanding now on that coverage, or taking maybe another angle on it, this paper of record series. So you are comparing a little known publication at the time and how it covered the movement at the time in Danville versus how the paper of record at the time covered it. So tell me which paper we're talking about here.
Yeah, so the paper of record at the time would have been the daily newspaper in Danville. It actually had two daily editions. There was a morning edition and an afternoon edition. The morning was the Danville Register, the afternoon was the Danville Bee. Later on, it combined to become the Danville Register and Bee, which still exists in Danville today. But that was the paper of record for folks in Danville at the time. So I'm comparing that coverage with the coverage of a weekly paper called the Commercial Appeal, which was still popular, but much less frequent. It only published on Mondays. And the two publications had very different approaches to how they covered the movement. The Register and Bee, and I heard this a lot when I was doing early interviews for my first set of stories on this, is that the Register and Bee at first didn't acknowledge the movement in its coverage. I think people kind of hoped that if they didn't give it any attention, it would sort of fizzle out. So there weren't, for the first week or so of protests, there weren't any articles in the Register and Bee about the movement. Once they couldn't ignore it anymore, they did finally start writing about it, but the coverage was it deferred to sources with the police department, with the city, like the judge, the mayor, folks who were kind of trying to tamp down the movement. There were no voices from protesters themselves, and no voices from very few voices of the civil rights leaders who were leading the movement. nothing about why the movement was happening, what these people were fighting for. It was all just kind of focused on the city's law and order response, the trials, the arrests, sort of kind of characterizing the movement as criminal, as feudal. And that differed very, very starkly from the commercial appeals reporting, which was a more straightforward, it wasn't necessarily in support of the movement, but it did include voices from national civil rights leaders, local civil rights leaders, editorials that supported the movement, which the Register and Bee did not include any editorials supporting the movement. So they had very different approaches, which affected how people who were involved in the demonstrations saw the movement and heard what they considered the truth about the movement.
Your first installment of Paper of Record, we get to know someone, we get to know one particular perspective on all of this, and that's from a woman named Dorothy. Tell us who that is.
Yeah, Dorothy is a lovely lady. She is a Danville native, and I spoke with her. I met her about 2 years ago when I did my first set of stories on this, and came back to her for this story because I remember her telling me back then that she, when one of the times she was arrested, there was a photo the next day in the paper of the moment of her arrest. It's her as a teenager. This movement was most of the participants were teenagers because Black adults in Danville were at risk of losing their job. So she's a young girl in this photo, and she's going limp, which is what demonstrators would do to sort of passively resist arrest, make themselves harder to apprehend without being, actively resisting arrest. So her body is limp, and both of her arms, there's a police officer on either side of her, and they've got her by both arms, dragging her to a police car. So that photo was in the Sunday edition of the Danville Register the next day. And I remember her telling me about that at the time. And then, now that I've started this story, I was going through all kinds of newspaper records and kind of searching for this photo, but also just reading through the rest of the coverage. And when I did finally come upon it, it was a really cool moment to see that picture that she was talking about, read the caption next to it. And I spoke with her for this story because she has really amazing memories of her family, sitting around the table on Sunday morning, opening up the newspaper and seeing that photo. And then, with her participation daily in these in these demonstrations, she remembered what the Register and Bee coverage looked like throughout that summer compared to what the commercial appeal coverage looks like. And her family and other families in the Black community deferring to the commercial appeal to get more accurate news about the movement.
Yeah, didn't her mother open the paper?
Yeah, her mother did.
Her daughter? I mean, this was compelling stuff.
Yes. She said her father would split up the newspaper around the breakfast table before church. They would each get a section. So she and her sister would get the comics, but her mom and her dad would split up the rest of the news. And her mother opened the paper, saw the photo of Dorothy, and she said, "Oh my God, that's my child." And that's the moment she described to me when obviously her parents knew she was participating. They were aware of what's going on. They were supportive of the movement, but seeing that photo in the daily paper, the paper of record, has a lot more weight to it.
Yeah, and you also say in this first installment of Paper of Record, you talk about Dorothy's memories of passing her mother, right? During one of these events, a protest. Tell me more about that, because that, again, I'm just thinking about the day-to-day of these people during this movement.
Right. So like I said, the movement, most of its participants were teenagers. It was a lot more risky for Black adults to participate, but Dorothy's parents were some of the few Black adults who did participate in the movement. So they were at the demonstrations, and her mother was arrested several times, just like Dorothy was arrested several times. And she described to me a moment where Dorothy she was being released from jail to go home, after she had spent the night there. And as she was being released, her mother was being escorted in. She had just been arrested. So they passed each other, in jail. She remembers her mother lying down. They used to do lie-ins, which are similar to sit-ins, but you're lying down on the sidewalk. She remembers her mother lying down with other women, and the way her skirt, its floral pattern looked against the sidewalk. So just really vivid details that she remembers. And her parents were obviously very courageous people to be participating in this movement when there was so much at stake. So the fact that they were, they were not easily shaken, but she opened the paper and she was startled by that image of her daughter.
Yeah. Another, it was also risky for white people who would give deference or any kind of acknowledgement to these protests. And one of the people in your story was a man named Charles Womack, who I believe was on the city council. Tell me
Yes.
about him. Tell me about him.
Yeah, yeah. Charles Womack was a city councilman. He was one of the very few city officials who was sympathetic to the movement. And he also happened to be the owner of the Commercial Appeal. So he had a kind of a lot of political clout there with owning one of the city's publications and with being on city council. So you're right, he did have a lot to lose, and yet he still voiced his support for the movement. At the time it was super subversive to even say, oh, I want to sit down with the civil rights leaders and hear what they have to say. Even that was seen as like ridiculous. Today, of course, maybe you'd expect someone to be super outspoken, super in support. At the time, even little things like saying, let's hear them out would have been really revolutionary. So he was one of the few council members who was willing to sit down with Reverend Campbell, Reverend Dunlap, other civil rights leaders, and just kind of try and negotiate, try and come to a consensus. He unfortunately faced some ostracization because of that. His family was the subject of some ridicule. I spoke with his son David because Charles himself has passed away, and his son David remembers him coming home from country club events where he had felt unwelcome. He stopped getting invited to things. Folks stopped wanting to come to their house, things like that, just because he was willing to try and find a resolution to the conflict that Danville was seeing.
In talking with David, Charles's son, is there any reason to believe that Charles and the publication he owned, the Commercial Appeal, was hoping just to get a competitive edge over the Register and the Bee by covering civil rights? Or
yeah, it's interesting you say that. Not really. My impression was that Charles Womack kind of owned the paper as sort of a labor of love. It was a weekly paper. Danville Register and Bee was much more popular, so the Commercial Appeal didn't make a lot of money. I don't think they could really hope to compete, only having one edition per week. A lot of the advertising money went to the daily paper. So it was just something that he did kind of because he loved it. He bought the paper in 1960. So when the first sort of stirrings about civil rights were happening, but way before the full-blown movement in Danville. So I think, from what David has told me, that Charles's goal was just to have an alternative narrative about the movement. Of course, the coverage that the Register and Bee was publishing wasn't accurate. It wasn't super robust. And so he wanted to have at least a weekly publication, have a different story about the movement being told.
you talked to some other people in your series, and one of them was Andrea Burney, who had an interesting story about her father, right?
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. So her father was a reporter at the Commercial Appeal, not during civil rights movement. He was a reporter a little bit earlier in the 50s. But that at the time was pretty unusual because this was a white owned paper, serving a primarily white readership at that time. And he was a Black reporter. So he was covering the Black community news for the Commercial Appeal. He was covering certain neighborhoods in the Black community and what the NAACP was up to. And that sort of content didn't exist at all in the Register and Bee, especially at that time. I think the Commercial Appeal's first Black reporter was in the 40s. Andrea herself, following in her father's footsteps, became a reporter, and she was the Danville Register's first Black reporter, but not until 1975. So that's over 3 decades of difference in when the Commercial Appeal had Black reporting and Black news versus when the Danville Register and Bee did.
Yeah. So let's get one thing kind of straight, because we are talking about the Register and Bee, which is now the Register and Bee, and it's still in existence in Danville. This is a series that's basically contrasting the coverage between these two publications. And you did reach out to the Register and Bee, correct, for just comment about what it was like during this time. What did you get?
Right. Yeah, it's important to remember that journalistic norms, not just in Danville, but everywhere, have evolved significantly since the 1960s. One of the things that I was so surprised to see when I was looking through these newspaper archives was a real lack of local news in general, to be honest. I mean, it's there, but so much of the paper was national and international news. There wasn't as much what you'd expect, today from a local paper to be about the community. There weren't bylines the way, this reporter wrote this story. There often weren't named sources. There would be a lot of unnamed sources. So things today that would make you question like a newspaper's reporting was very normal at the time back then. So of course the Register and Bee as an organization has evolved pretty significantly. And a lot of editorial and reporting content back then came down to who owned the paper. So because Charles Womack owned the Commercial Appeal and he cared about the movement, that sort of content showed up in his newspaper. The Register and Bee at the time was owned by the Grant family, who sort of just kind of turned a blind eye to some of the things that they didn't want to cover, the movement being one of those. So things have changed a lot. The Danville Register and Bee is now owned by Lee Enterprises, which owns dozens of newspapers around the country. I did reach out to them for comment kind of about their transformation as an organization and didn't hear back, but one of the local Black historians that I talked to for these stories talked about how the Register and Bee has become a more reliable source of news for people in Danville. It still is considered the paper of record. That's where people go to find their news. It publishes every day online and 3 times a week in print. So it is, evolved alongside the rest of the industry and is a reliable paper today and considered to be so.
Well, and some of us are old enough to remember, Grace, when when the printed newspaper came on your doorstep twice a day. So
Right.
it was the Danville Register and the Danville Bee, and I happen to be from the Roanoke area. So for us, it was the Roanoke Times and World News. You had a morning edition and an afternoon edition.
Right.
And in today's digital world, sometimes it's easy to forget that, no, this was printed. You mentioned how much national and world news was
Yeah.
in the, well, that's because they couldn't just go online and look at
Right.
the national news and
Exactly.
or see broadcast news online so as easily. So that tracks, that makes sense. Another interesting part of this, and you alluded to this early, was sourcing.
Mhm.
So talking to official sources, right?
Yes.
So talking, that would be akin to, covering a story today, maybe a spot news story about a crime, and you've gotten the press release from the police department, and that's all you did was write from
Right.
that, when in fact there are other places that you should follow up with. So tell me a little bit more about that, about the sourcing, and what if the Commercial Appeal was different, if that was the biggest reason, like talking to the people involved versus just officials.
Right. Yeah, that's a great point. I spoke to a journalism historian expert for this story who talked to me about the transformation of the industry between, 1963 and today. And something that was very, very common for reporting of that time was to defer to official sources, like I said earlier about always going to the police chief, always going to the judge and the mayor and the city representatives, rather than talking to people who participated in the movement. And of course, today as a reporter, if you were covering a demonstration, like almost the first thing you do is to talk to someone who was participating and say, hey, why are you out here? What are you hoping will come of this? What do you want to change? What are you fighting for? That sort of thing. And the Register and Bee never did that. And that was normal at the time. They weren't an exception when it came to that sort of approach. So a big difference was the Commercial Appeal quoting local civil rights leaders and less deference to the police department. So that's something else that has changed in the industry. And, it made me think about my own reporting. It's kind of this whole experience was very meta, talking about reporters, of a certain time, and then being a reporter myself today in the same community and looking at the way things are different. So it was really, really interesting thoughts
Well, and
aside from the reporting.
the spin has always been there, right? I mean, when the phrase "consider the source" is very, uh, relevant to this, not just in your everyday conversation, but when you
Right.
consider the source, you have to ask yourself, well, wait, who's telling me this story, and
Right.
what's the good thing to take away, but you need to follow up, right? So it
Mhm.
is an interesting look at journalism and, as you said, norms
Yes.
that have evolved over time.
Yeah.
What happened to the Commercial Appeal?
So the Commercial Appeal did continue for quite a while. It was in publication. I know that Charles Womack's son, not David, who I spoke to, but his other son, Charles Womack Jr., who everybody called Zan affectionately in Danville, he eventually owned the paper. And after that point, I don't know if anybody owns it after him or if he was with it until it stopped. It's no longer in publication, but it was up through at least the 80s, I believe. So it stuck around. There are online archives of the Commercial Appeal on Chronicle Virginia website, or Virginia Chronicle, I believe, which is what I used. So you can still read it. It's got a lot of really interesting stuff in there. It's cool to see, things about Danville from so long ago. So it's not around anymore today, but it was for quite a while.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about the sourcing or doing this whole series. Was it hard? Was it difficult to find things because
Mm.
these are some older publications? In the library, when I was younger, we would go to the library and look up microfiche. You
Hmm.
had this old data, right? And today
Yes.
it's online and it's right at your fingertips mostly. But was this a hard story to dig into? You very importantly and rightly talk to people. But as far as other things like the materials themselves, the photos and all that, was that pretty easy? Is it all right there?
Yeah, yeah, partially. So, like I mentioned, the Commercial Appeal has an online archive. The Danville Library does have all of the microfilm, or not all of, but they have quite a bit of microfilm from the Register and Bee archives. So I did the first couple times, I did go to the library and use the big, long computer and like filter through the microfilm, and which is a really cool experience,
I was
because
gonna
that's
say that's
exactly what it
fun,
looks
isn't
like.
it?
Yeah, it is fun. It is. But it is really slow going. You can't do like Control F and search for the words you're looking for. So it's not super efficient. So after doing that a couple times, I did finally just bite the bullet and get a newspapers.com subscription. So that has online archives as well at the Register and Bee, and you can search for different words and filter by date and sort of things like that. That made it easier. So once I got to that point, it still was a lot to wade through because there was a morning and afternoon edition every single day that entire summer. So it was a lot of content for me to wade through, and coverage about the civil rights movement was very often more inside the pages. It wasn't always on the front cover. So I did click through, almost. I know I did every edition from June and July. I think I got through most of August, but it was a lot of time spent just reading through those archives. As far as talking to people, luckily I did have a couple connections from previous coverage I did, like Dorothy, and like some historians that I spoke with. Grace Mamon is the lady I go to for everything when it comes to Danville's Black communities and their history. But as far as talking with people who were involved with these newspapers themselves, like I said, without bylines, including reporter names on the stories, including like a staff page or a masthead, it was really difficult to find people, especially for the Register and Bee, who were reporters at the time. I'm sure many of them aren't alive anymore, but I would love to talk to some of their descendants. It was just, you didn't have any names attached hardly, so it was difficult to find people there. The Commercial Appeal had a few bylines, and obviously I was able to track down descendants of the owner. But yeah, it was really interesting to just look back that far and kind of really have to brainstorm. Who could I talk to about this? Who might remember it?
It's such a good point to bring up that it wasn't necessarily on the front page. Again, who's
Yeah.
controlling the narrative? They're also controlling A, if it even gets in there, and B, where are you going to bury
Right.
it? So that's a great point to bring up. And
Yeah.
the whole issue with bylines too, Grace. This has just been so interesting, and I appreciate your work
Thank
in
you.
covering this as a follow up. Well, I mean, you just had ongoing coverage in Danville, especially this civil rights movement at the time. So we're grateful for the work, and thanks for coming on to have a conversation about it. People can find Grace's byline all over Cardinal News because she's covering so much there in Danville. Grace, how can anyone reach out to you if they want to talk to you about this or just have other ideas for Danville coverage?
Yeah, please do. I've gotten a couple calls and emails from readers who say, oh, I remember reading this at the time, or, my relative worked at one of the publications at the time. I always love hearing those stories. So please do reach out. Best way is probably email. It's Grace, GRACE at cardinalnews.org. So I answer all my emails. Just shoot me a message anytime.
And that's a good point too, Grace. We want to hear from the everyday people.
Yeah.
We have official sources. That's great. That's as it should be. We appreciate those relationships. But we want to hear from everyday people, too. So, Grace Mamon, thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. And thanks everyone for listening to the Cardinal News of Virginia. Thank you also to our sponsor, Muneris. And I want to thank Cardinal's own Zach Shelton for production support. You can read all of our paywall free journalism at cardinalnews.org. I'm Dutchie Jessee.